A reckless man, convinced he could sneak past security, attempts to break into Buckingham Palace. He thinks the royal guards won't react, but one soldier proves him dead wrong. With brutal efficiency, the guard shuts him down, and what happens next becomes a moment he'll never forget. The idea had started as a joke, a drunken boast among friends. It wasn't supposed to be serious, just the kind of reckless thought that comes when alcohol dulls judgment and inflates confidence. But the longer he stared at Buckingham Palace, the more it started to feel like a challenge. The place was legendary, a symbol of British power and tradition. Thousands of tourists swarmed the gates every day, snapping pictures, staring in awe, but never crossing the invisible barrier of respect and fear. Except him. He convinced himself that tonight he'd be different. He would go further. A steady buzz from too many pints pulsed through his veins as he studied the palace grounds. The towering gates, the ornate golden details, the perfectly kept gravel paths. It all felt untouchable. But what caught his attention the most were the royal guards. They stood like statues, their crimson uniforms striking against the gray London sky. Their black bearskin hats made them look even taller, more imposing, and their rifles, held with perfect discipline, hinted at an unspoken readiness for action. But they never moved. That was what fascinated him the most. For years he had heard stories about them, how they never reacted, no matter what was thrown at them. Tourists would scream in their faces, make obscene gestures, even try to block their path, but the guards never broke composure. How far could he push it? He didn't want to harass them like the usual drunk tourists. No, he wanted to outsmart them. A grin spread across his face as the idea solidified in his mind. He would sneak past the guards and touch the palace itself. It was absurd, impossible. But what if he could do it? Standing near the crowd, he pretended to be another ordinary tourist, blending in. His eyes flicked between the palace gates and the movements of the guards, studying the patterns. There were two stationed at the entrance, shifting positions with precise, synchronized steps every few minutes. Beyond them, security cameras loomed from the palace walls, and further back, deeper into the grounds, real security forces likely patrolled the unseen areas. But they were too far away to matter, if he moved fast enough. He noted a small gap in the barriers, where tourists leaned over to take photos. If he moved at the right moment, he could slip through. The thrill of it all sent a jolt of adrenaline through his body. The crowd around him was too focused on their own experiences to notice what he was planning. Some took selfies, others pointed at the windows, hoping to spot a royal figure behind the glass. Nobody was paying attention to him. This was his moment. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his jacket and steadied his balance. Then, with one decisive step, he moved toward the barrier and crossed the line. The moment his foot touched the forbidden ground, something in the air shifted. The palace, once a distant and untouchable monument, suddenly felt dangerously close. The towering gates loomed before him, dark and imposing, their iron bars just out of reach. Beyond them, the pristine white facade of Buckingham Palace stood in the afternoon light, its windows silent and indifferent to the fool about to challenge the limits of its security. For a brief moment, he hesitated. The gravel beneath his feet felt different from the side where the tourists stood. It wasn't just a step. It was a violation, a step into a place where he didn't belong. But nothing happened. The royal guards stood still, rifles gripped in their hands, their posture unchanging. He took another step, still nothing. A rush of excitement spread through his body, overriding his caution. Maybe all those stories were exaggerated. Maybe these guards were just for show, their presence meant to intimidate, not act. If they weren't reacting now, why would they stop him at all? A grin tugged at the corners of his lips. His pace picked up, confidence swelling in his chest. The thrill of it was intoxicating, crossing an invisible boundary that no one else dared to step over. The murmur of the crowd behind him grew louder. Someone had noticed. A few whispers turned into a ripple of shock, then into hushed conversations. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting to see if something would happen. Then came the first camera flashes. Phones were raised, lenses zooming in. The attention fueled him. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was becoming a spectacle. One more step, one more bold stride toward the impossible. The gates were so close now, the cold iron glistening under the sunlight. He imagined the headlines. "Man touches Buckingham Palace gates. Guards do nothing." Another step. Then the world shifted. A single explosive sound shattered the moment. Bam! A boot slammed against stone with such force that it echoed across the square. The ground seemed to shake beneath him. A rush of adrenaline crashed through his body. The tourists gasped. The air, which had been buzzing with whispers and camera clicks, now held absolute silence. One of the royal guards had moved, and this time it was for him. His heart slammed against his ribcage, his breath hitching. His body froze. He had been waiting for a reaction, and now he had it. The guard, who had stood as still as a statue just seconds ago, had suddenly shifted into action, his polished black boot now planted firmly in place. Not just a step, a warning. The rifle in his hands, once at ease, was now held at the ready. A silent message passed between them. "You've gone too far." The man swallowed hard, the weight of his situation finally crashing down on him. The game was over. And the guard? He wasn't done yet. The weight of the moment settled on his chest, pressing down with an intensity he hadn't expected. One step. That was all it took for the royal guard to shift from an unmovable statue into something far more dangerous. The impact of that single deliberate movement sent a ripple through the air. It wasn't just a step. It was a statement, a silent, undeniable warning. "You've gone too far." The atmosphere had changed entirely. A moment ago, the air had been thick with amusement and curiosity. A crowd of tourists had been snapping photos, murmuring in disbelief, watching him like a performer on a stage. But now, the stage lights had turned against him. The laughter was gone. The murmur of excitement had died into tense silence. All eyes were now on the guard, and what he would do next. The man's feet felt glued to the gravel, his pulse hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The guard wasn't like the others. There was no hesitation in his posture, no doubt in his stance. He was ready, and worse, he was in complete control. A statue had turned into a weapon. The guard's eyes remained locked forward, but his body was fully engaged now. He had seen him. He had judged him. And with a single movement, he had made his answer clear. Step back, or suffer the consequences. For the first time, the man felt something he hadn't expected. Fear. The confidence he'd carried just seconds ago, the reckless amusement, the belief that the guards were just decorations in a royal display, all of it had been ripped away in an instant. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. A wave of heat flushed through his skin as his mind fought against his body's natural instinct to retreat. There were so many eyes on him. Phones were pointed directly at him, their lenses capturing every moment, recording every second. Backing down now would mean public humiliation. If he turned away, if he stepped back, he'd be nothing more than a joke on the internet by nightfall. A coward. He couldn't let that happen. So, despite the screaming warning signals firing through every nerve in his body, he did the dumbest thing possible. He moved forward. He had barely shifted his weight when it happened. "Stand back!" The words ripped through the air like a gunshot. The voice was deep, powerful, and filled with an authority that left no room for argument. This wasn't some security guard's half-hearted warning. This was a command, the kind of order that stopped soldiers in their tracks, that sent adrenaline surging through trained fighters. The impact of it hit him like a physical force. His knees nearly buckled, his breath hitched in his throat as the weight of the command sank into his bones. The guard hadn't moved again. He didn't need to. The sheer force of his presence alone was enough to make it clear. This was the final warning. The crowd felt it too. The entire square had gone silent. No whispers, no nervous laughter. Nothing. The moment stretched out, heavy and suffocating. The man was now standing on the edge of a cliff. He could feel it. One more step forward, and this wouldn't just be a warning anymore. This was a test. The guard was giving him a chance, a single opportunity to make the right choice. But his pride, his foolish, reckless pride, screamed at him that he couldn't back down. Not in front of this many people, not while cameras were rolling, and so, against every shred of instinct telling him to stop, he took one more step. A fatal mistake. Because this time, the guard was ready. The moment his foot crossed the invisible threshold, everything changed. The royal guard exploded into motion. 1 second, he had been a silent, unshakable figure, his presence looming but contained. The next, he was a force of nature, a weapon unleashed. The rifle snapped up with terrifying precision, the polished steel gleaming under the afternoon sun. The once ceremonial presence had transformed into a living embodiment of duty, a soldier fully engaged in his sworn purpose. The air itself seemed to shift, thick with an unspoken understanding. This was no longer a warning. This was action. Before the man could even register what was happening, the butt of the rifle slammed into his chest with the force of a hammer. A brutal, controlled strike. Not wild, not excessive. Precise, measured, devastating. The breath ripped from his lungs in an instant. His world tilted sideways as his balance shattered. His knees gave out beneath him, his arms flailing as he desperately tried to regain control. Too late. Gravity won. He hit the ground hard, a cloud of dust rising around him as his body collapsed onto the cold gravel. The impact sent pain radiating through his ribs, his back, his arms. The shock of it was almost worse than the hit itself. Almost. For the first time since this foolish game began, fear truly gripped him. He had underestimated everything. The guards, their discipline, their readiness to respond. And now, lying on the ground, struggling to process what had just happened, he realized he had never been in control of this situation, not for a single second. A second of absolute silence. Then, chaos. The crowd exploded into gasps, cheers, and shocked exclamations. Phones were pointed directly at him, filming every humiliating detail. Tourists gawked in awe at the speed, the force, the sheer efficiency of the guard's response. This wasn't a playful nudge, a gentle redirection. This was a soldier acting on instinct, executing his duty flawlessly. The reality of it all crashed down on him. He wasn't a bold risk-taker. He wasn't a rebellious daredevil. He was a fool who thought he could challenge a force he didn't understand. And now, in front of hundreds of people, in front of rolling cameras, he had been shut down in seconds. As he gasped for breath, still sprawled on the ground, his eyes flickered upward. The guard was already back in position, still, unmoved, impassive, as if nothing had happened, as if the entire takedown had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his day. The guard didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even glance at him. He had done his job, nothing more, nothing less. And somehow, that made it even worse. The man had just been completely dominated, and the one who had done it didn't even consider him worth a second thought. He had gone from a daring intruder to a dismissed nobody in a matter of moments. Lying in the dirt, surrounded by laughing tourists and flashing cameras, one final thought seared into his mind. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. Pain radiated through his chest, every breath a sharp reminder of how badly he had miscalculated. The world around him felt blurred, overwhelmed by the rush of adrenaline, humiliation, and the crushing realization of his failure. His hands scraped against the gravel as he tried to push himself up, but his arms shook from the impact. His knees wobbled beneath him, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than the guard's strike ever did. Then, another sound cut through the chaos. Heavy boots on stone. Not just one pair, multiple. His heart dropped as he turned his head, his vision locking onto a pair of uniformed officers moving in his direction. Police officers approached with calm but deliberate movements, their expressions unreadable. Unlike the guard, whose presence had been silent and overwhelming, these men carried something different. Authority backed by the full weight of the law. There was no dramatic moment, no shouting, no slow-motion realization, just cold, professional efficiency. One officer reached for his radio, speaking in low tones while the other moved toward the man on the ground. A firm hand gripped his arm. Not rough, not aggressive, just final. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't something he could argue his way out of. The reality hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a stupid prank gone wrong. This was trespassing. This was a security breach on one of the most heavily guarded sites in the world. This was a criminal offense. The weight of the cameras still rolling, the crowd whispering, the guards standing resolute. It all melted away as steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He was done. As the officers lifted him to his feet, the crowd parted, clearing a path as they led him away. The air was thick with murmurs, scattered laughter, and the unmistakable sound of people whispering to one another. Every step he took away from Buckingham Palace felt like another nail in the coffin of his dignity. Phones were still pointed at him, recording every agonizing second. He could already picture the headlines, the internet reaction, the flood of mocking comments and memes that would follow. Man tries to break into Buckingham Palace. Ends up face down in gravel. Royal Guard takes down idiot who thought he was untouchable. Dumbest criminal of the year? His stomach churned at the thought. And yet the worst part of it all wasn't the crowd. It wasn't the cameras. It wasn't even the police escorting him away. It was the guard, still standing in the exact same position, rifle in place, his body unchanged, unshaken, unmoved. He had already forgotten him. He had been nothing more than a minor interruption in a soldier's duty. The realization settled in his gut like a stone. He had been reduced to nothing. And now he would have to answer for it. As the officers pulled him toward the waiting patrol car, his eyes flickered toward the gates one last time, the place he had wanted to touch, to cross, to conquer. Now, he would be lucky if he ever got within a mile of it again. The Royal Guard had won, and he would be paying for this mistake for a long, long time.